Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Kirk. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I was just sharing with Kirk that this is my first time speaking in person since, for about 2 years, since December of 2019. So I am really happy to be back, face-to-face, interacting with people. I like to move around. I won't be at the mic very much. And what I want to do is I want to cover a few things, talk about sustainability and longevity, but it'll probably be from a different perspective than what you're used to hearing. Before I got into the cannabis space, I was a risk engineer. And I'll share a little bit about my background and why I'm so concerned about climate change and the impact that it can have, not just on the cannabis industry, but on all of us. Like if you already have an existing business, this is something that you should be looking into as well. So when I got into the cannabis space, I originally went into like the ag tech sector. I created an invention, and I was moving away from my old corporate gig and getting into something new. But my old gig was being a risk engineer for insurance companies. And while I enjoyed what I was doing, I really didn't really like working for insurance companies. So when I transitioned to the cannabis space, I said, I don't want to talk about climate. I don't want to talk about natural disasters. I was kind of running from my past, but my past will not let me do it any longer. So I have to talk about it. I have to share. So one of the things that I learned as a risk engineer, and just to back up, what's a risk engineer? A risk engineer is an engineer that goes around and assesses what can happen if there's a disaster. So that can be a fire, an explosion, or a natural disaster like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes. I worked for some of the top insurance companies for over 15 years. I worked for a company called FM Global, which is at the cutting edge of some innovation and research technology out there. I worked for AIG, which they had a lot of Fortune 500. Most of the companies that we insured were in the $100 million or higher range, going all the way up to capacities of 4.2 billion. So these are really large value locations that we were evaluating. And I also worked for Liberty Mutual, which is more of a well-known insurance company. But for all of these companies, what I was in charge of and what I started is in natural disasters. I focused a lot on hurricanes, floods, hail. I wrote a lot of the standards, the underwriting standards, the engineering standards for some of these companies, specifically AIG and Liberty Mutual. So I'm coming at this from a perspective of having more information that Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies have that some of the everyday citizens don't have. So I wanted to share some of that information with you so that you could be aware of what the situation is and maybe take some proactive steps towards protecting your business, your home, and your livelihood, really. So one of the other things that I wanted to cover is a lot of people know that you have to get insurance, property insurance, but insurance does not cover everything. When you have a natural disaster, such as this, and this is a widespread flooding event, insurance will eventually come in. You'll file a claim. They'll put you back together regarding your property damage, your contents, the equipment. They'll probably replace most of that, and I say probably because you're going to have to do the claim adjustment process to figure out what that is. But what insurance does not cover is your loss of market share. When you have a loss in your facility, your customers are going to go somewhere else, especially for cannabis. That's a necessity for a lot of people. They're going to move on to a different company, and they're going to perhaps fall in love with that brand and maybe not return to you. So we always used to tell our clients, when we were in the insurance space, you're going to want to be proactive about protecting your facility, because we may insure you, but in most cases, companies may get themselves back up and running within 6 to 12 months, but around 2 years or so, you start to see a financial decrease in their revenue, really because of loss of market share. So it's really important to try to avoid that interruption from the start, from jump, not relying so much on your insurance company to be there to cover you. So I'm going to talk about that too. All right. This document here is the 4th National Climate Assessment Report. It came out in 2018, and it was updated in 2019. I was told, I don't know how true this is, I was told that this came out on Black Friday of 2018, which is typically what you put some bad news out there that you don't want to have a lot of news and get a lot of traction As you can see specifically right there, it says climate change poses several challenges to transportation and stormwater systems in the Midwest. That's infrastructure. That's widespread impact. That's not just something that's going to happen to one location. That's going to affect an entire region. So one of the things that, and I know, when it comes to recreational cannabis and medicinal cannabis, my understanding that is in Illinois, the majority of that is indoor, but there are also outdoor farmers that are doing hemp, which is a whole separate entity in itself. So I'll be mindful and talk about both indoor exposures and outdoor exposures. Is there anyone else here that's an outdoor farmer or cultivator, or mostly all indoor? Okay, got you. I'm also going to focus mostly on flood, stormwater damage. We've evaluated and we deal with situations like earthquake, wildfire, but for this particular geographical region that we're in, the biggest concern that I have and that most people have is flood and stormwater. And to be more specific, there's a difference between, a coastal flood. Coastal floods happen, in Miami we hear about hurricanes all the time where you get waves coming in and impacting buildings and destroying infrastructure. And then, when the storm is over, the water recedes, and then they're able to get back and start working on repairing the damage. Here, in this area, you have something called inland flooding. It's more of flooding that happens from lakes or bodies of water that, they overflow, they get to a certain height, and then they start to spread out and cause flood damage to large geographical regions. That's one hazard you have to consider. The other hazard is what's called stormwater. Stormwater is when we have just a storm with a lot of rain. It pours down a lot of precipitation in a very short amount of time. And what can happen is it'll back up the stormwater systems and cause flooding in smaller regional areas. So that's something you have to consider as well. Okay. So when you're trying to figure out whether or not you're exposed to a flood or stormwater, we have flood maps, yes, created by FEMA. How many of you are aware of have ever looked at a flood map or are aware of your location's proximity to a flood zone? Anyone? Okay, all right. Do you know if you're in a flood zone or out? Do you mind shouting that out?
Yeah, we are.
You are in? Okay, how about yourself? You're not? Okay. So even if you're in, all right, we know we have something that we have to handle, but even if you're outside of a flood zone, you need to be concerned. Even when I was out evaluating properties, if you were within 5,000 feet of a flood zone, we basically considered you in a flood zone. And the reason why is because as an insurance company, we have loss data. We can look and see what's going on after an event. And we know, the insurance companies know, that the FEMA flood maps are way off. Way off. They're severely outdated. They're supposed to be updated every 5 years, but that does not happen. The majority of the flood maps in our country are severely out of date, including those in the Midwest. And the reason why they need to have them updated time and time and time again is because we're constantly making changes to the terrain. We're building, we're knocking down trees and laying asphalt and paving things with concrete. That changes the entire geography in the landscape. So when it starts to rain, you don't have a lot of trees and soil there to hold and stop all that water from just flowing down the street. It's a lot different. Also, we have climate change that we have to consider because things are changing, as we know. So those maps need to be updated time and time again. You may have heard of a term, when you're looking at your flood maps, the 100-year flood, the 500-year flood, the 25-year flood. The problem that we're seeing is, one, that terminology is misleading. It makes people think that you're only going to flood every 100 years, every 500 years, or every 25 years. That's actually not the case. It's really more probability. When people say 100-year flood or 500-year flood, they're talking about you're going to have a 1 out of 100 chance of flooding that year. The 500-year flood, you're going to have a 1 out of 500 chance of flooding that year. So they started changing the terminology from if it was the 500-year flood, they called it the 0.2% flood. 1 over 500 is 0.2% flood. The 100-year got changed to 1% chance. So it's 1% every year. The problem that one of the things that people are concerned about, and this fourth national climate report that I showed you earlier mentioned that a lot of those 100-year situations are actually 25, maybe 5. So it's not so much that things are going to be going past the flood maps, they're also going to be increasing in occurrence as well. So we use flood maps as just a best, a starting point. It's a way to kind of at least let us know where are we in proximity to the potential of being flooded, but it does not, it doesn't mean that's it. Personally, I live in a coastal zone. I live in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I am 100 feet outside of a flood zone. I don't have to buy flood insurance, but I do, because I know, from my background, that 100 feet will be wiped away like that, and I'm going to have to deal with some sort of an exposure. So I say all that to say, we have these flood maps, but they're really not adequate right now. All right. Let's also talk about some of the levee systems that we rely on as well that tell us to be protected by a flood, but we might not necessarily be. This is just one example. I mean, we've got obviously Hurricane Katrina and the levee system that failed during that. We're all aware of that. I was at I had the pleasure of listening to a researcher speak about Hurricane Katrina and the loss of the levee at Tulane University, and he went really into detail, and he shared with us, the fact that it was designed, but when they went to install a lot of the columns, so what they do when they build a levee system, it's a wall, but you can't just build a wall, and you have to build a foundation for that wall, or when the water comes, it'll just, flop over. So you have to drill pylons deep down into the earth. One of the issues was that it was only drilled down, in some cases, 40% of what it was supposed to be, and maybe sometimes 60%. I don't remember ever seeing anything that was 100. All of them were inadequate. So there were lots of different reasons why that levee system failed, but the last line of defense is just physical construction of the barrier, and because it wasn't designed adequately and actually built adequately, it failed. So you can see here in this, it says the lens small levee, even if it repairs, still won't be good enough. And our systems that we use, let me just show you the next one. This is the National Levee Database. This is available to the public. You could pull this up if you wanted to. It's free to look at and to search for your location. But if you can see, hopefully you can, it talks about the fact that this is flooded already. We already know that the levee failed, but they call this a low population and sparse development with leveed area contribute to a low potential consequences if flooding were to occur. Well, the people that live there probably don't think it's a low flooding potential. And this rehab program, it's inactive. It's not even on the rehab program list. This was in just 2021 that they updated this information. Additionally, right before I transitioned out of my old corporate life into Trello Technologies full-time, which is in 2019, I was doing a last round of a training program to leave with the engineers so that they would have something before I left. And I went back to the National Levee Database to do a training session on how to look up levees, and noticed that there was information that would tell you when the last time the levee was inspected and if the levee actually passed that inspection. It was free, available to the public. I could pull it up, so we trained our engineers to pull those up anytime you're going out to a location and check. I happened to be looking, doing some training material, and I needed to get a screenshot of that again to include it in the material, and it's missing. So I called the ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers. They're the ones that are responsible for this National Levee Database. And I get another engineer on the phone, and he says, yeah, they took that off. And I said, well, were they going to do some sort of an announcement, or I don't see anything on the news section of the website. There should be some sort of information, like public announcement about taking such vital information off of your website. And he goes, no, I think they're going to do it, but I'm not quite sure. And he kind of laughed because he knew where I was coming from. That information would show, and it does show, that the majority of our levees may not have been inspected, and if they are inspected, they're called minimally accepted. That's kind of like it can be accepted, not accepted, or minimally accepted. The majority of them are minimally accepted, and a lot of them are unaccepted. But we can't see that. If you wanted to, I said, well, what if I wanted to know? If I need to know this information, how do I do it? He says you have to call the local town or the owner of the levee, because not all of our levees are owned by, the state or the local entity. Some of them are owned privately by organizations. You have to call the owner and ask them to give you that information. So information that we used to have access to about the state of our protection systems, our infrastructure, are being removed. So that caused more concern for me, especially when I was on my way out the door, that they know that this problem is really getting out of hand, and they're starting to do things to kind of cover themselves, unfortunately. So I talked a little bit about flood zones and the capacity for them to flood outside of the map zones. This is an example from FEMA's website. They also have this really cool map. It's called the National Flood Hazard Layer, where you could go in and put your address and you could see where you are in proportion to a flood zone. The blue that you see right there is called Zone A. Zone A is considered that 100-year flood. And you can see that it kind of goes in a few different directions. And it also goes across streets, maybe main highways. It might affect off-ramps. When you're looking at your location, you may find a location that's not in the flood zone and you're like, score, all right, cross it off my list. Not yet. Check and see what's the main road that gets to your location. Is that exposed? Because inland flooding, like I talked about before, flooding that happens when big bodies of water kind of get to a certain height and spread out, that can last, that flooding, that water will be there for several days, maybe even over a week, and then eventually it recedes. And during that time, if you need to get material in and out of your location, you're going to be impacted, potentially. If you happen to have a transformer, it's not your transformer, it's the town's transformer, but it supplies electricity to you and everybody down your street. If that transformer is in a flood zone, you got to worry about that, because that's going to potentially impact you as well. So pull up the maps and just take a look and see, all right, if I needed to get to and from, am I okay? Let me go see where my main transformer is. It may not be owned by me, but I want to know where my my nearest substation is. Is that in a flood zone? Check that out as well. And you can do all this from the FEMA website. One of the other things about inland flooding floods, and the fact that they stay for so long, is they're gross. You're going to have water and sewage from everybody that's around you sitting there. And I can remember one of the other things that we would do, so we wouldn't just go out and evaluate what would happen. We also would go out and evaluate the loss after it happened. So we'd go into some of these facilities after the flood, the water's receded, it might be 2 weeks later, and the insurance engineer and the claims person are just getting there 2 weeks later. So think about that impact as well. We just get there 2 weeks later, and it might be because we're not allowed to get into that space. They might block it off for a certain amount of time. Eventually we're able to get in, and the smell and the nastiness is just, you almost might lose your lunch. It's not a clean cleanup at all. It takes time. Additionally, the availability of your human resources, your team. You may come up with, some sort of a response plan, something about, you may decide that, all right, I may need a sandbag, or perhaps we can, buy some flood doors or some flood, panels and get those things all arranged. Or maybe your response is that you need to move something from one area and move it to another. That's all great. But if your team that lives in the same area is impacted by the same disaster, are they really going to be are you going to be able to 100% rely on them to be there to help when you really need them to? So that's one thing you need to communicate and talk to your team members about. If they are actually going to be on some sort of a response plan team, can we really rely on you to be here? If they're in a flood zone, maybe they shouldn't be included in your response plan, because they're going to want to take care of their family and their property as well. The other thing is, when you're out for 2 weeks, like I mentioned, it might take 2 weeks for people to get in and out of this location. You may have backup power supply that might be good. It might still be running, but you're going to need to be able to get into the location to check on things. You may not be able to do that as well. So your availability of your human resources, might not be as reliable as you think. So make sure that you spend a little bit of extra time communicating with those that you need to make sure that they're on the same page, in alignment. Talked about supply chains. That's having issues with roads that might be washed away. I think it was where was that? Up north, BC, was it? There was a huge road that just got highway that got like washed away. That type of stuff can happen here too. While I was preparing for this, I know that Lakeshore Drive, depending on how much it rains, that has sometimes been washed with water, and you can't get people or supplies to your destination. So really make sure that you're not just looking at your location, that you're looking at everything around you. All right. One other thing that insurance doesn't cover and nobody really talks about is the emotional distress, a little bit of the PTSD that happens during a disaster. I've been at losses and seen and heard stories of people that quit. They relocate to another area. Unfortunately, one gentleman had a heart attack. It's a very stressful moment. So the more that you're prepared for this and that you're not surprised, the better. The other thing is, when you're dealing with cannabis, hemp, or a farm, you're stuck in that location. Like, that is your location. Some of the things that other insurance or other companies can do, that have insurance companies that kind of prepare them for this, is they find a backup location where they'll say, all right, the insurance company will come in and pay the cost to rent you another property and move your equipment there so that you can start operating and maintain your market share. Well, when you've got a cultivation license that's tied to a certain location, or you've got a farm that's tied to a certain location, you don't have that option. So, just take that into mind as well. You really have to look at your location and make sure that you'll be able to maintain where you are versus trying to go somewhere else. Or maybe you have the ability to do that. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's got a lot more hoops to jump through. Okay. So what can we do? Talked about looking at the flood maps. We covered that already. You want to develop a flood response plan. It's also called a FERP. This company here, Zurich, is an insurance company. They have a lot of really great free material on their website to help people develop flood emergency response plans. Check them out and see if there's anything on there that that would be useful to you if you're in a flood zone. And also practice your flood emergency response plans, especially if they rely on supplies. You'll see people, I don't know if this is the one. No, I'll talk about that on the next slide. I'll come back to that. Some of the other things that you can do is relocate or raise critical equipment. If you happen to have a water tank or transformers or any type of equipment that's sitting in a flood zone, and if you are looking to purchase it and construct it for the first time, that's a great time to tell people, hey, raise that up 4 feet for me. Let's do a structural, scaffolding system. Put the equipment on top of that so that you're up and elevated out of that floodplain. Those are things that you can do from the beginning. And if it's already been installed, then you might want to find out how much it might cost to have those types of things raised up or relocated out of the floodplain. But it can be very expensive after the fact. So if you're still in the planning phase, it's a great time to look into it. All right, next slide, and then we will get into questions pretty soon. Okay, if you're relying on some sort of a backup power system like a diesel generator or a natural gas, that can be impacted too. Your natural gas can be impacted. Your diesel, probably you got to do the calculations to figure out how much time do you have before that generator is going to kick out. You want to consider, I would say, 2 weeks. That might be a lot of fuel that you'll need for that. So what you can also do is find out if your supplier of your diesel fuel will be willing to put you on a contract in case of a disaster. Sometimes they're willing to say, all right, if something happens, will come to you first. You're gonna have to pay a premium for it, and you may only need to pay the premium when the disaster strikes, but you wanna be on the top of that list. You wanna have a good relationship with them and make sure that, hey, we need 500 more gallons of diesel so that we can keep this thing going. Please come out. And you don't wanna wait until the day of when everybody else is calling them. You wanna do that way, way in advance. So that's something else to consider. If you have backup water systems, sometimes there might be water tanks that are located outside. If they're not at a certain level, things can float away. They can become buoyant, so consider that as well. Let's see, sandbagging. A lot of people rely on sandbagging. It does require a lot of human resources, a lot of time, and it has to be done correctly. The way that they're doing it right now looks pretty correct. It's in the long way, and they're kind of overlapping one over another. I've seen situations where people have paid a lot of money to get the sand. They've got the bags. They put them all down, but they laid them this way. The water's coming this way. They laid them this way, and they stacked them side by side. You don't want to do that. You want to, and there is on Zurich's website and some of the other, you can always contact me if you're in need of any information. I'll share my contact information at the end of this. But if you're looking for, hey, where can I find this or where can I find that, we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. But you can find ways in directions on, all right, if I'm going to have to sandbag around a certain area or across a certain doorway, how many do I need? How long is it going to take me? And how do I do it the right way? You want to do all that before the disaster. That's part of your flood emergency response plan, is figuring all that type of stuff out. You also want to consider being able to, especially if you can, it might be difficult for different types of, if it's cultivation, extraction, retail, some of these things will vary, but if you can automate certain things to stay on while you're not there, that's great. But in some cases you may not be able to do that. So consider, and if you are automating it, make sure that your backup system is adequately sized to keep running all of those automated processes while you're not there. So that could be making sure that you're not relying on the need to have somebody come in and check on your nutrients or your pH or your water levels every week if you know that you might not be able to get there for 2 weeks. So take care of. So if you had to walk away for 2 weeks, the place would be okay. Think at that scope, in that level. All right. Okay, and I think that is all. Any questions? And feel free to get specific. If I don't know, I'll let you know, or I'll look into it. Yep.
Are you or your team or anybody in the industry working with regulators to try to mandate any kind of environmental steps that businesses, cultivation facilities can take to be a little bit more efficient?
No, we're not working with any environmental regulators. Our approach has been awareness to let people know that the problem exists. Unfortunately, I did sit on a couple of different organizations that were in the area, but they moved too slow, in my opinion. Any other questions?
What is Trello Grow?
Oh, so Trello Grow is an automated plant training system. It automatically trains your plants, especially if you have like a mother plant that you want to allow to veg for a very long time. It will control the height so you can stack them and put them on multiple levels within your facility. So that's the invention that I invented. But one of the things that I had to think about is we started in 2016 and we're still going and we're progressing and we're into the market now, so things are progressing. But during those hard times, you always have to go back to like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And it's this climate change thing for me. For me, I'm really concerned about our food supply. We started with cannabis with this design, but it can impact food as well. So I'm really concerned about our food supply. That's going to be one of the main things that we should be focused on, food and shelter. When they drop somebody off in the middle of nowhere on those shows alone, first thing they do is food, second is shelter, because you need the calories from the food to be able to build the shelter. So for me, food is number one in regards to climate change. So this system here is designed to allow us to diversify the types of plants we can grow inside and to eventually get to the point where we can grow food in transit. So if we have locations that are no longer able to grow food because of lack of arable land, we can grow it and send it across railroads, or and also one of the other, or across the ocean with ships. Some of the biggest costs to food is transportation. So if we can grow and transport at the same time, that would significantly help. So that's what Trello Grow LST is. Yep.
You talked a lot about flooding, right? And you talked a lot about engineering controls.
Mm-hmm.
My background's construction, and so I learned a lot about safety. And engineering controls is it's like the last step in the chain, right?
Mm.
Like when you have a problem, you build something to fix it. That's an engineering control. But if you can prevent that problem from happening in the first place, that's a better solution.
Mm-hmm.
So what in your opinion would be something that's not an engineering control that we can do to mitigate flooding in our regions?
Well, you're talking about construction, right? That's the best time that you can do it, is when you're actually building it from scratch. It's building things that are elevated higher. Like, for example, if you go down to the Florida area, or along the coast, you'll see buildings that are built up on columns that are naturally designed to withstand the impact of a coastal flood. In some cases, you might even see buildings that don't look like they have columns, but they do. They actually are they're knockaway walls. So when water impacts them, the wall lets go. Water can flow through the building, and it's a sacrificial space, versus hitting the wall, causing buoyancy, lifting it up, and taking it away. Ooh. That was for effect. So that's one example. The other is really trying to make sure that you're not in a flood zone, and in some cases there's not much that you can do about that. There are systems that you can buy, like flood doors, flood barriers. There's a lot of innovative things happening out there. Some of them are approved. Like, if you're going to buy something, you want to make sure that it's been tested. Like flood doors, flood barriers. There's lots of them out there. Some of them say certain things. Some of them say other things. Was it tested? And was it tested by FM approved? So there's an FM Diamond. You can get FM approved flood barrier systems, or UL does some flood certification as well. But you can buy things that will protect the entire space. So we've seen there's systems out there where it's basically just an inflatable, balloon that's move this out the way. Or I'll move. Inflatable balloon that's shaped like a tube, and you can put it out there, inflate it, and then when the water comes, it just protects the entire site. So that's great. But then it doesn't deal with what's happening to your infrastructure from outside, like if you happen to have something else that you're relying on that's outside of that space. So what you can also do is not rely on public infrastructure as much as you possibly can. There are solutions out there like solar panels, geothermal, which supposedly has better resistance to flood. Like, you could have a geothermal system where it's built underground. So if the first thing that's going to flood is your geothermal system, can it withstand that impact? I've asked one company that, and I was told that it could, but they didn't provide me with any, backup information, so I'm not 100% certain. Did that answer your question, or are you looking for? Okay.
In the building stage, would you suggest, in order to prevent water cooling or flooding, things like bioswales or permeable pavement around facilities?
Yeah, there's also some really cool things with that. Permeable pavements, bioswales. I've seen some really great things with people, especially with outdoor farming, using a lot of grading and slope to try to understand, okay, it's going to flood, but let's at least just control the flow of it, and to modify the terrain accordingly, or to have some of these different permeable systems that will allow water to drain quicker versus accumulating and flowing in another direction. But yeah, those are good ideas too. Yep. All right. Anything else? I believe that's it. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks, Rick. You can hit that off too. I'll grab it. Thank you.